Illyria Vance meticulously wipes down the old wooden counter of the Whisperwind Lodge, the polished surface reflecting the dim light of the overhead bulbs. Each wipe is a quiet, almost ritualistic acknowledgement of the lodge's dwindling life. Once a beacon for adventurers, a hub for climbers and solace seekers, Whisperwind now feels like a ghost of its former self. The new, sleek Summit View Resort, built on the opposite valley, with its heated pools and gondola access, has siphoned away their traffic like a mountain stream rerouted. Bookings are a trickle, the online reviews are sparse, and the mounting stack of bills on Illyria's desk threatens to bury them. Her brother, Thomas, sits by the large stone fireplace, his back to the room, staring out at the darkening forest. He traces patterns on the worn arms of his wheelchair, a perpetual frown etched into his once vibrant face. Thomas was the heart of Whisperwind, a legendary mountain guide. His tales of daring ascents and intimate knowledge of the Cascades drew people from all corners. His voice, once resonant with the wisdom of the peaks, now rarely rises above a murmur. 5 years ago, a misstep on a notoriously tricky ridge, a sudden rockfall, changed everything. The accident took his legs, but it stole his spirit. Illyria had tried everything to reignite that spark, pouring her own life savings into keeping the lodge afloat, hoping the familiar surroundings would heal him. But Thomas remained a prisoner of his past, his connection to the mountains now a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Tonight, a sinister chill had begun to creep in, far too early for season. The weather forecast, crackling over the old radio, spoke of an unprecedented early-season blizzard, a whiteout expected to descend upon the high passes. Illyria glances at Leo, their quiet college intern, who is struggling to light the ancient wood stove in the kitchen. He looks as uncertain as she feels. She makes a difficult decision. "Leo, let's start packing down. We'll close early. This storm sounds serious. No one should be up here tonight." The words taste like ash. Closing early means another lost day of revenue, another nail in Whisperwind's coffin. But the safety of potential guests, and frankly, her own exhaustion, overrides a financial despair. She switches off the iconic Whisperwind Lodge open neon sign, the flickering open, winking out into the encroaching gloom, leaving the lodge feeling utterly alone. Illyria moved with a heavy heart, securing the windows, pulling the heavy drapes against the rapidly plummeting temperatures. The wind had begun to howl through the eaves, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness within the lodge. She checked on Thomas, who hadn't moved from his spot by the fireplace, his gaze still fixed on the swirling snow outside. A wave of sorrow washed over her, a deep ache for the brother she had known, the one who would have been excitedly discussing survival tactics or advising on emergency preparations. Now, he was a silent sentinel of their fading dream. She was about to turn the final lock on the heavy oak front door, sealing Whisperwind against the storm, when a faint, insistent rapping echoed through the silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold brass. Every rational instinct screamed at her to ignore it. The lodge was closed. They had barely enough food for themselves, let alone unexpected guests. The roads would be impassable soon. But then she pictured a solitary soul out in that burgeoning maelstrom, and her resolve wavered. With a sigh, she pulled the door inward, just a crack. A blast of icy wind tore through the opening, carrying with a flurry of snow and the silhouette of a man. He was heavily bundled, a sturdy backpack strapped to his shoulders, snow clinging to his beard and hat. "Evening," the man said, his voice deep but strained. "Any chance you're still open? The pass behind me is completely shut, and my GPS just died. Didn't see another light for miles." He pulled back his hood, revealing a kind but weary face, lines of cold etched around his eyes. He introduced himself as Silas Thorne, a photographer caught off guard by the storm's sudden ferocity. Illyria's initial hesitation wore with her ingrained hospitality. She glanced at the nearly bare pantry shelf she just checked, the few logs left of fireplace. Then she met Silas's gaze, seeing not an inconvenience, but a fellow human in dire need. "Come on in," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Warm yourself by the fire." As Silas thawed by the hearth, grateful murmurs of thanks filling the space, the door jingled again, and again, one after another, more vehicles, caught unaware by the storm's rapid onset, pulled into the small, snow-choked parking lot. A young family with 2 shivering children, their car barely visible beneath accumulating snow. A pair of college students on a hiking trip, their youthful bravado replaced by chattering teeth. An older couple in a modest sedan, their faces pale with worry. Whisperwind Lodge, would have been utterly desolate just an hour ago, was now filled with the shuffling of boots, the quiet exclamations of cold-weary travelers, and the anxious hum of conversation. Ilara's heart twisted. They were 12 people huddled in her failing lodge, and she barely had enough provisions to feed half that number for one meager meal. Thomas, from his corner, remained silent, but Ilara felt his eyes on her, a mixture of helplessness and something she couldn't quite decipher. Ilara moved with a heavy heart, securing the windows, pulling the heavy drapes against the rapidly plummeting temperatures. The wind had begun to howl through. Ilara, with Leo's quiet assistance, moved with practiced efficiency, masking her internal panic. She rummaged through the sparse pantry, pulling out what little remained, a couple of half-empty cans of chili, some dried pasta, and an assortment of canned vegetables she'd been saving for their own meals. The ancient coffee machine sputtered to life, its comforting aroma a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. She began to improvise, stretching ingredients, turning a handful of wilted greens into a makeshift salad, supplementing the chili with extra beans. The small kitchen, usually quiet, now clattered with the sounds of preparation, a tiny defiant orchestra against the storm's fury. As the plates, meager as they were distributed, a tentative warmth began to spread through the lodge. The initial anxious silence gave way to hushed conversations, then to shared stories of narrow escapes and unexpected detours. Silas, having found a seat at the counter, offered to help. He had a natural calm about him, a reassuring presence. He noticed Thomas in his corner and, after a moment, approached him. "Rough night, huh?" he offered, a small smile on his face. Thomas grunted in response, still averted. Suddenly, a voice boomed from a table near the fireplace. "Wait a minute, is that Thomas Vance?" A grizzled, older man with a weathered face, one of the hikers, squinted at Thomas. "Thomas Vance, the Whisperwind sage. You guided my first summit on Mount Rainier back in '99. You pulled me off that ice ledge after I twisted my ankle." The room quieted, heads turning. Thomas froze, a flicker of something long dormant in his eyes. Ilara, clearing plates, stopped dead, her hand limp around a stack of mugs. The hiker, emboldened, continued. "You remember? We called you the Mountain's Whisper. You always knew what she was going to do. Best guide the Cascades ever saw." Murmurs rippled through the room. Another traveler, a young woman with bright, curious eyes, chimed in, "My dad used to talk about you. Thomas Vance, the one who scaled the Devil's Tooth in that rogue storm last decade." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thomas straightened. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the kind Ilara hadn't seen in years. "You boys sure remember more than I do," he said, his voice rough but warm, a hint of his old cadence returning. Laughter, genuine and hearty, filled the lodge. Stories began to spill out, not just of the storm outside, but of Thomas's legendary exploits, of blizzards weathered, of lost trails found, of lives saved by his calm guidance. Ilara watched, a lump forming in her throat, tears blurring her vision. She poured another cup of coffee, letting the moment, the raw, beautiful sound of her brother coming back to life, wash over her. But the night wasn't done with its tests. A sudden, jarring shudder ran through the lodge. The old heater coughed once, then fell silent, plunging the room into a new, bone-chilling cold. Silas was already moving, his boots squeaking on the worn floorboards as he knelt by the ancient furnace in the basement access panel. "Give me a minute," he muttered, disappearing behind the kitchen door. Illara wrapped her arms around herself, not just from the cold, but from a fresh wave of panic. The food was almost gone. Her internal thread of hope felt like it was unraveling. H to eaves, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness within the lodge. She checked on Thomas, who hadn't moved from his spot by the fireplace, his gaze still fixed on the swirling snow outside. A wave of sorrow washed over her, a deep ache for the brother she had known, the one who had been excitedly discussing survival tactics or advising on emergency preparations. Now, he was a silent sentinel of their fading dream. She was about to turn the final lock on the heavy oak front door, sealing Whisperwind against the storm, when a faint, insistent rapping echoed through the silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold brass. Every rational instinct screamed at her to ignore it. The lodge was closed. They had barely enough food for themselves, let alone unexpected guests. The roads would be impassable soon. But then she pictured a solitary soul out in that burgeoning maelstrom, and her resolve wavered. With a sigh, she pulled the door inward, just a crack. A blast of icy wind tore through the opening, carrying with a flurry of snow and the silhouette of a man. He was heavily bundled, a sturdy backpack strapped to his shoulders, snow clinging to his beard and hat. "Evening," the man said, his voice deep but strained. "Any chance you're still open? The pass behind me is completely shut, and my GPS just died. Didn't see another light for miles." He pulled back his hood, revealing a kind but weary face, lines of cold etched around his eyes. He introduced himself as Silas Thorne, a photographer caught off guard by the storm's sudden ferocity. Illara's initial hesitation wore with her ingrained hospitality. She glanced at the nearly bare pantry shelves she'd just checked, the few logs left for fireplace. Then she met Silas's gaze, seeing not an inconvenience, but a fellow human in dire need. "Come on in," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Warm yourself by the fire." As Silas thawed by the hearth, grateful murmurs of thanks filling the space, the door jingled again. And again, one after another, more vehicles, caught unaware by the storm's rapid onset, pulled into the small, snow-choked parking lot. A young family with 2 shivering children, their car barely visible beneath accumulating snow. A pair of college students on a hiking trip, their youthful bravado replaced by chattering teeth. An older couple in a modest sedan, their faces pale with worry. Whisperwind Lodge, what had been utterly desolate just an hour ago, was now filled with the shuffling of boots, the quiet exclamations of cold-weary travelers, and the anxious hum of conversation. Illara's heart twisted. There were 12 people huddled in her failing lodge, and she barely had enough provisions to feed half that number for one meager meal. Thomas, from his corner, remained silent, but Illara felt his eyes on her, a mixture of helplessness and something she couldn't quite decipher. 10 minutes later, Silas reappeared, smudged with grease and smelling faintly of oil. He flashed a tired but triumphant grin. "She's an old girl, but I patched her up best I could. Should hold for now." A collective sigh of relief swept through the lodge as the heater rumbled back to life, its valiant efforts slowly pushing back against the invading cold. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was a reprieve, a testament to shared problem-solving. Still, the food situation weighed heavily on Illara. When the last scraped-out pot of chili was served, when the last few slices of stale bread had been passed around, she quietly slipped away into the tiny living quarters behind the lodge kitchen. With cold fingers, she rummaged through her personal pantry, the emergency stash she'd meant for their own lean days. Cans of baked beans, a forgotten bag of old apples, a frozen loaf of homemade banana bread. She carried it all back into the kitchen without a word, her movements determined. Leo looked at her with wide, worried eyes, but Lara just nodded, setting the items by the stove and starting to prepare what she could. The travelers noticed. No one spoke directly of it, but their faces softened, their conversations growing quieter, imbued with newfound respect. Some things Alara knew. You don't repay with money. You repay with simple, profound understanding. That night, nobody left. The storm had intensified, blanketing the mountain in an impenetrable shroud of white. They pulled together tables, pushed benches against walls, spreading out jackets and blankets to create makeshift beds around the crackling fireplace. Alara found a few extra quilts from the linen closet and handed them out, her touch gentle. Laughter and low conversation filled the air, mingling with the scent of strong coffee and damp wool. Silas, ever practical, tuned the old lodge radio, finding a scratchy station playing folk songs that seemed to emanate from another lifetime. But it was Thomas who truly became the heart of the night, rolled into the center of the gathering. He was no longer the silent figure haunted by his past. He swapped stories with the travelers, passed out advice about mountain safety and local legends, his eyes alight with a familiar spark Alara had mourned for so long. At one point, a young student, no older than Leo, sat cross-legged on the floor, listening wide-eyed as Thomas recounted a harrowing tale of navigating a whiteout on Mount Rainier, his voice a steady comfort against the chaos. For a few precious hours, the blizzard outside might as well not have existed. The Whisperwind Lodge, worn and weary as it was, had become a lighthouse again, a place where lost souls could find each other and ride out the night together. Because on the mountain, as in life, there are no strangers, only fellow travelers. And that night, the storm could howl all it wanted. Inside Alara and Thomas's lodge, the fire kept burning fiercely, beautifully. 2 days after the blizzard, the Whisperwind Lodge was quiet again, eerily so. Outside, the world was transformed into a pristine, silent tapestry of snow and ice, the drifts piled high against the windows like enormous meringue. The sky, a brilliant, piercing blue, seemed to mock the recent chaos. The mountain roads, plowed and salted by diligent crews, were mostly clear now, allowing the last of the stranded travelers to depart with heartfelt thanks and promises to return. The distant hum of vehicles on the main highway, now restored, never reached their secluded corner. Inside, Thomas sat at the counter, not in his usual withdrawn corner, but at the main serving area, slowly wiping down the worn wood with a damp cloth. His movements were thoughtful, almost meditative. There was a lightness in his demeanor that hadn't been there in years, a faint echo of the man he once was. He even offered Alara a small, genuine smile when their eyes met. Alara, near the front door, swept the last lingering snowflakes from the old tiles, the broom soft scratching a rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking clock. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, on the bills she still couldn't pay, on the for sale sign she knew was still leaning awkwardly against the old storage shed out back. The night of the blizzard, filled with laughter and stories, with shared warmth and renewed hope, felt like a dream now, something too vibrant, too profound to have truly existed in the cold, stark light of morning. The brief spark that had ignited in Thomas was still there, but was fragile, flickering. The coffee pot sputtered half-heartedly, a metaphor for their own dwindling energy. The world had moved on, and Whisperwind Lodge, despite its heroic night, seemed destined to be left behind. Thomas, observing Alara's somber expression, rolled closer. "It was good, wasn't it?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd heard it in ages. "Having people here alive?" Illara nodded, a tear prickling at the corner of her eye. "It was everything," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But everything is still gone. The bank won't care about warmth and stories, Thomas." His shoulders slumped, the brief flame of hope in him dimmed by the harsh reality. He squeezed her hand, a gesture of comfort she hadn't felt from him in years, but his eyes held a lingering sadness. He was beginning to find himself, but the lodge, their home, their shared purpose, was still crumbling around them. The for sale sign, now partially buried under fresh snow, felt like an epitaph. Days bled into a week, each passing hour bringing Illara and Thomas closer to the inevitable. The bank's final notice had arrived, cold and unyielding. Illara had tried calling every number she knew, explored every desperate option, but the answer was always the same. Whisperwind Lodge was finished. She was sitting at the counter, numbly staring at the stack of paperwork, when a faint rumble began to vibrate through the old floorboards. It was low at first, like distant thunder on dry land, growing steadily louder. Thomas, who had been absently tracing the grain of the wooden counter, looked up sharply, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. The rumble crescendoed into a series of heavy, unmistakable sounds. The hiss of air brakes, the deep thrum of multiple diesel engines downshifting, the crunch of heavy tires over packed snow. Illara dropped the papers. Outside the frosted windows, a vehicle appeared, then another and another. Within minutes, the parking lot, which had been empty and silent, was bustling. A small fleet of rugged SUVs, work trucks, and even a couple of tour vans stretched down the side road, glinting under the pale winter sun like a caravan come home. The front door swung open, and there stood Silas Thorne, bundled against the crisp air, a wide, crooked grin on his face. "Hope you've got more coffee ready, Illara," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent lodge. Behind him, drivers and passengers spilled out of their vehicles. Many Illara recognized from the blizzard night, their faces now beaming. Others were strangers, but their expressions held a familiar warmth. The lodge quickly filled with the joyous chaos of boots, laughter, and the overwhelming noise of life returning. Silas approached Illara, pulling a folded envelope from inside his jacket. "We passed the hat around," he said, his voice softer now. "The hikers, the families, the researchers, even a few of Thomas's old climbing buddies we tracked down. Companies, local businesses, everyone chipped in." Illara stared at the envelope, thick and heavy with a hope she hadn't dared to even whisper. "It's enough," Silas added, his eyes kind. "Enough to clear the bank. Keep the lights on. Start over if you want to." Her hands trembled as she took it, speechless. Before she could find her voice, an older man with a salt and pepper beard, wearing a well-worn climbing jacket, stepped forward. He held out a small, intricately carved wooden figure of a mountain goat. "I think this belongs to you, Thomas," he said, placing it gently on the counter. "You carved this for me after our first climb. A good luck charm. Figured it's time it came home, for your new beginnings." Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth, like it might disappear. His throat worked silently, emotion catching deep in his chest. He nodded once, a small, fierce movement that spoke volumes. Illara, watching him, felt something crack and heal at the same time. Silas clapped Thomas on the shoulder with a laugh. "Words out, Thomas. Everyone from here to Yosemite knows about the Whisperwind Lodge now. You're not getting rid of us that easy." Laughter erupted across the lodge, warm and wild. Leo ducked out from the kitchen, his mouth agape at the sight of the packed room. The for sale sign, now entirely buried under a fresh drift of snow, was forgotten. Inside, Thomas turned the carved goat over in his hands, a genuine, joyful light returning to his face. Hope wasn't a sudden miracle. It was this battered voices finding their way back, open doors in a world of closed ones, the stubborn belief that kindness still mattered. In Thomas's eyes, Alara saw it, the thing she had almost forgotten how to hope for, not just survival, but life, real, messy, glorious life. And this time, they wouldn't be fighting alone. 1 year later, Whisperwind Lodge was alive again. The parking lot overflowed with vehicles from all corners of the country, their roofs glinting under the high mountain sun. Inside, the lodge buzzed, boots stomping, coffee pouring, laughter echoing off the old wood beams like it had never left. On the far wall, a new framed photograph hung proudly. Thomas, smiling, standing by a mountain trail marker, his face alight. Heard this place is kind of legendary now, a new guest remarked to Alara. She chuckled softly. First coffee's on the house, she said, and so's a story, if you're staying long enough to hear one. Outside, vehicles came and went. Inside, stories began again, stitched together by shared trails, lost nights, and second chances. Alara leaned against the counter for a moment, letting the sound of life wash over her. And in the golden hum of it all, she could almost feel Thomas beside her, not as a memory, but as part of the air itself, still watching the door, still welcoming the mountain home. Still here,